just like ESPN turns to Adrian Wojnarowski for all their latest NBA breaking news, we turn to our reporter on the inside, the man who speaks Russian and has covered the country for forever, our buddy Alex Kliment over at GZERO Media. Alex, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the pod again with us.
Good to be here, as always.
Alex, there was so much to get to. You and I have been texting over the weekend after the death of Alexei Navalny that happened in Russia at a prison. I want you to kind of explain that to our audience, the latest with what's happening in the war. We're going to get into Tucker Carlson and if he's somehow lost at a McDonald's in Moscow right now. But on a serious front, let's get into the first thing, because Navalny's death, and CNN was replaying the documentary over this past weekend. I know you spoke to the actual filmmaker who made that documentary once upon a time. Can you kind of, for our audience, just explain who Alexei Navalny is? Maybe they saw this, a critic of Putin's died. I thought all of them die, right? Because Putin has been killing a lot of his critics. Just kind of explain what Alexei Navalny stood for in Russia as an opposition leader, his death, and what he was facing when he was in prison. Some of the charges, people don't even know why he was in prison and why he went back.
Right. So, just to kind of start it off, just so people have an understanding of what it means that Alexei Navalny has died. Alexei Navalny was the most prominent and certainly charismatic and outspoken critic and opponent of Vladimir Putin. That doesn't mean he was widely popular in Russia, which I'll get to in a minute. Doesn't mean he was a perfect angel of a person, which I will also get to in a minute. But the headline is the last great hope of the Russian opposition is now gone with the death. I would say with the murder of Alexei Navalny. Who was Alexei Navalny? In brief, he was trained as a lawyer, quite a young guy, 47 years old, when he was killed last week. He was trained as a lawyer, and about a decade ago, a little more than a decade ago, he started a foundation that basically was focused on exposing corruption in the Russian elite. And a lot of people have tried to do that, and a lot of people have done it. Very few people have done it with the kind of social media savvy and panache and humor and charisma that Alexei Navalny was able to bring to this issue. He also had dalliances with hardcore nationalist elements in Russia. Early in his career, he said some extremely problematic things about Muslims and immigrants from Central Asia. He was not a sort of cuddly liberal Democrat, in the way that the West likes to think of its dissidents, right? He was a highly complicated and problematic figure in a highly complicated and problematic country. He was at the height of his power around 2012. When he and a couple of other opposition figures were able to get hundreds of thousands of people into the street in the largest protests in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they were focused, again, particularly on corruption, right? His slogan was, "This country is being run by a party of crooks and thieves." And he, was quite popular. And actually, he ran for mayor of Moscow in 2013 and did decently well, with all the odds obviously stacked against him. But it's worth pointing out that outside of Moscow and outside of St. Petersburg and outside of this kind of more educated cosmopolitan elite, Alexei Navalny was not hugely popular in Russia. If you look at opinion polling of what Russians thought of him, the majority of Russians, if they had even heard of him at all, said that they didn't approve of his activities, right? Some Russians just don't know who he is in the first place. And I think that's a function of a couple of things. First of all, the Russian media has been stacked against Alexei Navalny for a long time. Most Russians, by the way, get their news from television. 2/3 of Russians get their news primarily from television. That's the opposite of what we have here in the US, where 2/3 of people get their information primarily online. And the television in Russia is controlled. So the messaging around Navalny has been to suppress him a lot. His most prominent followers are sort of cosmopolitan liberals who have mostly left the country now. So it's important to note that although he was popular in the West, he wasn't widely popular in Russia. Still, he posed a significant threat to Putin. And I think that was for two reasons. One, He was not a cuddly, as I said, he was not a sort of liberal Democrat who was from the 90s, era of Russia, who was really pro-Western and kind of, a liberal Democrat type. Those people were totally discredited by the chaos and humiliations of the 90s. Navalny couldn't be painted as one of those people. He was younger, he's from a different generation, and his politics were not about trying to be like the West. His politics were about these people in power are screwing you, and they're screwing all of us, and they're making Russia a weaker country for it, right? So he had this very nationalistic kind of perspective, and he was zeroing in on corruption, right? And those are two things that Putin did not want people focusing on. He does not want people focusing on corruption, and he does not want people who can, craft a nationalistic message. That's Putin's job. It's Putin's job to be the nationalist in Russia. He doesn't want someone else doing that. So on several occasions, he was arrested. And of course, in 2020, which your listeners may know, he was poisoned at an airport in Siberia. He was flown out of the country to recover in Germany. And then while he was in Germany, he and his team figured out that the Kremlin had basically ordered his poisoning. In fact, there's an incredible scene in the documentary that you mentioned, which is called Navalny, which won an Oscar last year. Last year was directed by Daniel Roher, who as you mentioned, I interviewed. There's an incredible scene in the documentary where Navalny gets a Russian security agent he pranks the guy and pretends that he's the guy's boss. If you can find a clip of this from the movie, it's worth dropping into the pot because it's an amazing scene. He pretends to be this guy's boss, and he calls him up and he's like, "Hey, this is your boss. I need to talk to you about something. Tell me about what happened at that airport in Siberia." And the guy basically spills the beans on the whole thing. He's like, "Yeah, we tried to, we put the poison in his underwear. It didn't quite work. I don't know how he survived. Sorry, whatever," right? Gets the guy to admit, right, a Russian security services official to admit that they tried to poison him. So anyways, he's in Germany. Then he decides when he's healthy again to go back to Russia. Everybody says you're crazy. If you go back to Russia, they will arrest you. They will throw you in prison for the rest of your life. Of course, that's exactly what happened. He showed up in Russia. He was jailed for 3 or 4 years on extremism charges, something totally trumped up. And then for good measure, they added another 19 years last year. They put him in some of the most severe solitary confinement you can imagine, Arctic prisons, the Gulag. Your listeners can imagine what that's like. And then last Friday, we got the news that he had died under mysterious circumstances. Whether it was a slow motion murder or Putin called someone up and said, "It's Friday, February 16th. You're supposed to kill this guy." We'll never know. But the result is clear. The Putin system killed this guy because he was a threat to Putin, a potential threat to Putin, even if at the moment he wasn't widely popular. And I think the upshot of the whole thing is that the Russian opposition has lost what you call in sports terms a generational talent. It will be almost impossible in the short term to replace Alexei Navalny for the Russian opposition.
Listen, this is why Nick and I started this show, because a breakdown like that about, again, like you just said, a figure that's popular in the West, or at least known to people that follow foreign policy and geopolitics, but somehow in his own country, even in your article, you said there's like a quarter of people that don't know who he is because they get their news consumption from media. So many different twists and turns. I appreciate you explaining to that. I do want to get into now what's actually happening, what's been at the forefront for the news folks here in the U.S. about the war and the latest that's happening in Ukraine as Vladimir Putin and his soldiers continue advancements. I saw a recent article from Al Jazeera that said something about Russia had taken full control of a Ukrainian town, and I'm not going to pronounce it because I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. I think it's Avdiivka, but
Avdiivka. Yep.
Avdiivka. There we go. Okay, so my slight Russian used on some women is not working. So anyway, Alex, in all seriousness, now the war right now, the way it's being treated in news media here in the West is very C block. I was telling you this earlier. It's very like, here's serious, and then here's, kind of semi-serious. Like it's not really getting covered as much as what's happening in Gaza, the hostage stuff. And then obviously we have primaries coming up here on the GOP side in the US. So can you kind of take our audience in terms of what's happening with the advancement? And obviously there's some stuff with President Biden and Ukraine funding for aid. What's the latest on the war right now, at least with Russia advancing and taking capture of a Ukrainian city?
So the phenomena that you're talking about with Western media is this dreaded Ukraine fatigue, is what people talked about a year ago. They said, the longer this war goes on, the more people are going to get tired. People's attention spans are short. There are other issues that get people much more riled up. I mean, nothing gets people's attention and, outrage more than anything having to even remotely to do with Israel and Palestine, right? So that's just drawn people's attention. But I think it's also because the ground war in Ukraine has become something close to a stalemate, right? Early in the war, Russia made big gains. Then Ukraine pushed them back. Then Russia came back a little bit. Then Ukraine was starting for a number of months to wage this counteroffensive, where they were going to hope to push Russia back massively out of some of the territories that they'd occupied since 2022. That did not work. Basically, it ground down in trench warfare in eastern and southern Ukraine, and the front lines have not moved a whole lot. And to the extent that they have, the Russians have been advancing. And yes, over the weekend, they took a strategic town in eastern Ukraine called Avdiivka. The debate around this has been, should the US and Europe continue to support Ukraine? And importantly, to what end, right? The Europeans agreed to give Ukraine another $50 billion a year for the next several years. That's basically to keep the lights on in Ukraine. The bigger issue is, can Ukraine get more military aid? And that comes from the US. To put this in perspective, the United States has given more than all the European countries combined to Ukraine. The United States is the indispensable military supporter of Ukraine. At the moment, there's, as you mentioned, in Congress, there's a big debate about, the Republicans have been holding up Ukraine funding, tying it to increase security at the southern border. There's been a lot of jockeying around that. But the basic question on the ground in Ukraine is, Ukraine can't continue fighting without more Western aid, right? And so the question is, A, is that aid going to be forthcoming? But B, I think a bigger question underlying all this is, to what end? When people talk about Ukraine winning, it's not clear what exactly that means. Does that mean pushing all Russian troops out of every inch of territory that they've occupied since 2022? Does it mean pushing them out of Crimea, which they've occupied since 2014? So it's not entirely clear. And I think part of the issue, right? Republicans in Congress are playing games with the immigration stuff ahead of the election. That's obvious. But I think there is kind of a serious question about what people mean when they say, give Ukraine what it needs in order to win. If winning means pushing Russia entirely out of the country, that's not necessarily a feasible option. But if winning means, being armed to the teeth to be able to defend some kind of partitioned Ukraine in the long term, maybe that's more achievable. The problem in Ukraine is that no one in Ukraine wants to give up any territory to Russia. And frankly, why should they? But the strategic aspect of what's going on may start to work against them before long, particularly if the US isn't able to cough up more money for the Ukrainian armed forces.
Alex, at the start, it seemed as though if the Russian invasion did not have immediate effect, did not come to an immediate resolution of, essentially Ukraine surrendering, it seemed early on that the longer this was drawn out, this may be in Ukraine's favor. But what we've seen recently, with a change, obviously, among Zelensky's military officials, is your read also that public sentiment? I'll also think about in Moscow, we saw protests early on of the invasion, which seemed unheard of, in right. Russia. Has public sentiment in Russia and almost internationally seemed to be, you mentioned fatigue, but is there also a potential malaise or something working within the Russian government or even among the people where they're starting to build some momentum toward Putin's vision?
Well, look, I mean, I think, a longer conflict favors Russia for a couple of reasons. One, if it's just about throwing bodies at the front, Russia's got more bodies, right? I mean, this is how, a combination of endless ranks of bodies on a really cold winter is basically how Russia's won most of its wars in its history, right? So, both sides are struggling with manpower and munitions, but Russia is able to draw on a much deeper supply of bodies, and they're also getting weaponry from North Korea and from Iran, which is helping them to plug that gap. The Ukrainian side is a lot more difficult, right? It's a much smaller country. morale in Ukraine is very high about not ceding any territory to Russia. But if you look at the debate about, you mentioned some political divisions within Ukraine, and you're absolutely right. One of the big questions is, does Zelensky think he can pull off a wider conscription, basically another draft? And he's really reluctant to do that because there's a lot of people who, although they don't want to give any territory to Russia, they're also really wary about going into a fight, which looks more and more like a meat grinder. I mean, what Ukrainian troops have been doing over the past 2 years is absolutely extraordinary. These guys are going into battle with like 3 weeks of training. This is not like, this is not a super highly advanced and well-trained, standing army, right? I mean, there are guys like that in the Ukrainian military, but a lot of these guys have been rotating in and out from, on short deployments with minimal training. They come back super traumatized. They have to be turned around, sent back to the front immediately. It's really grim. And there's a lot of Ukrainians who will respond badly if they're asked to, be drafted and go to the front. So both sides are struggling with their issues, but I think the longer it goes on, it favors Russia just because of the manpower issue. And also because in the West, Russia doesn't, Putin, since you asked, he doesn't have to deal with like serious political fissures over this war anymore, right? I mean, he's running the joint now. He's cleared off, obviously, Navalny, but also the last time we spoke, we were talking about Yevgeny Prigozhin, right? He's also cleared the biggest military threat to his power. So Putin, there can always be palace intrigue in an autocracy like that. One never knows, right? That's what Kremlinology is for. But basically, Putin doesn't have to respond to electoral cycles and alliance politics and, trying to wrangle allies to spend as much as they're supposed to for the main military alliance. He doesn't have to deal with that stuff. So I think in a longer, the longer it goes on, it favors Putin, not only because of manpower, but also because of the particularities of an autocratic system like that, which is that he just can operate on a longer time horizon. The guy's been in power for 20 years. What's he worried about another 20 months, right?
Great point. Speaking of Vladimir Putin, there was I don't know if I want to use this word, but let's use it. An American journalist that recently went out to go and talk to him in Moscow. If you don't know who this person is, him and I both worked at the same company once upon a time. That's Tucker Carlson. You wrote an article that said Tucker Carlson went all the way to Moscow for that, and it had a couple of question marks there. I don't want to necessarily get into the interview, although allow you to get into it if you want in your response. But I do want you to hear something that Tucker recently said at the World Government Summit that happened in Dubai. And by the way, I mean, nobody knows more about government than Tucker Carlson, right? That's why you invite him to your conferences. So I want you to listen to something that he said to the moderator who was asking him about the interview and him not pushing back on some of the things that Putin said in the interview. Now, remember, Putin's English is as good as my Russian. So obviously there was a translator in the mix with the interview with Tucker. But I want you to kind of hear what he said, and it's drawn the ire and it's been making the rounds on social media. So take a listen to this.
You should challenge in the rules of an interview, and you're a master in your business. It's not for me to give you a lecture about that, but you should challenge some ideas. For instance, you didn't talk about freedom of speech in Russia. You did not talk about Navalny, about assassinations, about the restrictions on opposition in the coming elections.
I didn't talk about the things that every other American media outlet talks about.
Why?
Exclusively.
Yes, this
because
is my
those
question.
are covered, and because I have spent my life talking to people who run countries in various countries and have concluded the following: that every leader kills people, including my leader. Every leader kills people. Some kill more than others. Leadership requires killing people. Sorry. That's why I wouldn't want to be a leader. That press restriction is universal in the United States. I know because I've lived it. Ask my former, I've had a lot of jobs. And I've done this for 34 years, and I know how it works. And there's more censorship in Russia than there is in the United States, but there's a great deal in the United States. And so, at a certain point, it's like people can decide whether they think, what countries they think are better, what systems they think are better. I just want to know what he thinks. That was the whole point.
So there's a lot there, and maybe like a tiny fraction, very tiny fraction, I agree with. We'll get into that in the wrap. But the biggest thing that I've always said about Tucker Carlson, and again, I am not 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon separated from Tucker Carlson. I can get Tucker Carlson's phone number tomorrow and have a conversation with him. I know somebody, Nick and I both have a mutual friend that is very close with Tucker Carlson. My argument has always been the pot committed part of this. This is a poker term. You have a pair of aces. You have top pair. You make the bet. The flop comes out. It's a king. It's a 10. It's a 5. You have the top pair, but somebody's betting into you, but you feel like you're the top pair, A, and B, you are pot committed. That's your money. So you have to go do that. He has to wake up every morning and he's got to do that type of content. Is he conservative? Sure. Does he feel the same way about some of these things? No, because he knows now that he's on his own doing content on X and stuff like that. He has to play to this extreme core that will gain him the views and, you know, the monetary gain from that. That aside, although I would love your take on that, what did you make of the interview and what he said there about leaders kill all the time and that's why I don't want to be a leader? What was your overall takeaways from the interview and what he just said there in that soundbite?
Well, look, I mean, a couple of things. He said people talk about, the rest of the U.S. media talks about these issues constantly. That's true. The U.S. media does talk about it. The U.S. media, the Western media, has not had an opportunity to ask Putin about it directly. Tucker had that opportunity and did not really take it, right? So I think, you know, he's right that there's no shortage of, I mean, if you want to find people writing about how, you know, Putin killed Navalny, you can ask me. You can read the New York Times. It's out there, right? But when you have an opportunity to sit with a leader like that and put the question to them, even if you know they're not going to answer it, you have the opportunity to put those hard questions. A good journalist takes it. So that's one thing. I think, you know, he for whatever reason didn't take that opportunity, and I don't think his explanation in Dubai was satisfactory, because it's the difference between talking about things and then having the opportunity to ask them. Secondly, the thing about leaders kill people, he's absolutely right. Leaders do kill people. Our leaders are killing people as we speak, undoubtedly. That's not an interesting or introspective point to make. That's like a sophomore, like getting stoned and like trying to be deep comment. Like, we all kill people, dude. It's so fucked up. That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is why? Why are we killing people? Why are leaders killed? What are the reasons? Who is being killed, right? That's the question you have to ask. And it's a fair question to ask of leaders in the US, fair question to ask of leaders in France, fair question to ask of leaders in China, and it sure as hell is a fair question to ask of leaders in Russia. And if you're sitting in front of the leader of Russia and you don't take that opportunity, it's a lost opportunity. You're a loser, basically. So you know, that's my take on that. You know, the interview was, I mean, you know, I thought it was hilarious that Putin said, let me just start off with the 30 seconds on history, and like literally spoke for 30 minutes about like the Varangian princes and the Rurikid dynasty and Yaroslav the Wise's dream. I mean, it was like amazing. I mean, for like Russian history nerds, it was great. It was a highly warped history, right? Like, which the point of the history was to say Ukraine is not a legitimate nation and Russia has claim to this land. Whatever. History can be debated. History can be interpreted however people like. The biggest problem for me is not that Putin's history is Russo-centric, right? Everyone has their own version of history. Problem with his history is that in every single one of his answers and in the history that he gave, it's as though there's not a single other country or people anywhere in the entire world except for the US and Russia. There's no agency of anybody outside of the US and Russia. So the Ukrainians don't have any agency. The countries that wanted to join NATO after the 1990s, they didn't have any agency of their own. They were just forced into it by the US. That's the problem with his worldview, I think. The main problem with his worldview is he sees it exclusively as like great powers decide what happens. And I mean, you can see he wants to conclude a peace treaty about Ukraine by talking to the US. Right? He's like, yeah, I would love to talk to Joe Biden about peace in Ukraine. It's like, well, what about the Ukrainians, right? That's the big issue. So that was my take on a lot of the stuff that he said. But as someone who follows him closely, he truly didn't say anything new. I mean, it may have been new for a lot of people to hear it in the US, but there was not a whole lot of new material there in what he said about history or his grievances about NATO expansion or how he feels that the US has treated Russia unfairly, which is not entirely untrue, but certainly doesn't justify the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Not a whole lot new there. I thought it was amazing that he the power move he pulled on Tucker when Tucker said, so who blew up Nord Stream? And he said, you did. And Tucker said, well, no, I was busy that day, or whatever it was. It was very funny. And then Putin just dropped the dossier on him and was like, no, I understand that you tried to, it was the CIA, an organization that I believe you tried to join at one point, but were rejected. Well, anyway, they're a pretty good organization. It was just like, it was great. It was pure, like, former KGB mind game stuff. And Tucker was just like, got totally sunned by the whole thing. He was just sitting there like, what? I thought that was an amusing moment in an otherwise somewhat boring interview.
Alex, turning to a more serious reporter, we think about Evan Gershkovich right now. And in general, you've talked on this show about the challenge of truly being informed in Russia because of state-controlled media. Is there any hope for any form of independent journalism in Russia, or for people within the country to truly understand what's going on? And I alluded to this earlier with the protests at the start of the invasion, and what seems to be potentially a malaise or something that may be brewing in an acceptance among the Russian people. But where do you stand right now with, obviously, a journalist still being trapped there, but in general, the hope of the potential for journalism thriving in Russia at this point?
It's extremely bleak. I mean, Evan Gershkovich was reporting on national security issues in Russia, obviously. And that's why they picked him up and arrested him and said, you're a spy, because from the Russian perspective, anyone who's looking into that stuff is a spy. It's very difficult. There is a small handful of Western journalists who are still doing very good work in Russia. Steve Rosenberg at BBC is absolutely one of the best. And he asks really hard questions when he gets a chance to sit down with these guys. He did a phenomenal interview with Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, a couple of years ago, which is worth watching. But in general, it's for Russians, it is extremely hard to get any reliable news at all. As I said, 2/3 of Russians rely on TV primarily for their news, and TV is completely state controlled. And there's online stuff, and Telegram has become a big source of, I'm not sure if I would call it news, but I would say information at least. But it's very difficult. It's an extremely atomized society. It's very repressed politically. Protests are almost impossible to hold. And one thing I think is interesting also, the casualty figures are in like the six figures in Russia, right, from this invasion, which, proportionally is like more than the US lost in Vietnam. It's the most deadliest war in since World War II, basically, for Russia. Worse than Afghanistan. And you don't see a whole lot of response to that. I think there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, a lot of the people who are doing the dying are from remote or poor regions of Russia. I mean, not unlike a lot of people who were in the US military when we first sent to Iraq and Afghanistan, right? This was not like, the elite children from Moscow and St. Peter. I mean, in our case, the coastal elites, right? Similar situation in Russia. So a lot of the people who are doing the dying are not from the centers of power. And it's a very atomized society. Again, it's hard to build momentum towards protest, right? Particularly when it's easy to be tarred as an agent of the West and all this stuff. So I am not particularly optimistic on that front. And to bring it back to what we started talking about, the loss of a opposition leader like Alexei Navalny. Again, he was not super popular, but his role was to be a force of hope that there could be something that could challenge Putin someday. And that's why Putin killed him, but that's also why a lot of more educated cosmopolitan Russians who truly wanted to see a different Russia really believed in Navalny. And I think that dream is in a deep freeze now.
He's the best at breaking this down. You can go check out all his work over at GZEROmedia.com, senior editor of the GZERO Daily, which I get all the time in my inbox. Alex, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the podcast, giving us a couple minutes. Continued success to you, my buddy. Stay safe.
All right. See you. Take care, Nick. Thank you, Mike.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.